Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 20875 in the name of Audrey Nicholl on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee on its substance misuse in prisons inquiry. I would invite those members who would wish to speak in the debate to please press the request to speak buttons, and I call on Audrey Nicholl on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee to speak to and to move the motion. Up to 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I'm very proud to open this debate this afternoon on the Criminal Justice Committee's report into the harm caused by substance misuse in Scotland's prisons. And can I start by thanking our excellent clerking team, particularly Lucy Miller, also Spice and Pat team colleagues, for their support during the inquiry. Now, this inquiry began with accumulation, rising drug-related deaths in custody, escalating use of synthetic substances, repeated warnings from oversight bodies, and persistent concern from families and staff that the system was not reducing harm in the way that it should. And over months of evidence, prison visits and private engagement sessions, we examined what drives substance use in custody, how effectively it is prevented and treated, and what must change. The first and most consistent message we heard was this: substance misuse in prisons cannot be understood in isolation from the wider public health challenges in Scotland. The report sets out clearly that people entering custody are disproportionately affected by poverty, trauma, adverse childhood experiences, unstable housing and poor physical and mental health. Prison does not create these inequalities, but the evidence suggests it can intensify them. We heard about the changing nature of drug supply, synthetic cannabinoids now dominating seized samples, increasingly potent substances arriving via drones and contaminated items, and the constant adaptation of organised crime networks. We heard that drug trend testing shows higher levels of drug positivity on admission, meaning that many people arrive in custody already living with addiction. Witnesses repeatedly told us that boredom, long hours, locked in cells, inconsistent access to purposeful activity and gaps in mental health provision all drive substance use in prison. Where distress is unaddressed, substances can fill the void. We were struck in particular by the evidence around dual diagnosis. Mental ill health and substance dependency are frequently intertwined, yet services are not always integrated in practice. We also heard directly from people who have experienced addiction in custody. They spoke about withdrawal following arrival, about self-medicating anxiety, and the difference it makes when a member of staff treats you as a person rather than a problem. Those contributions were among the most powerful evidence we received. They shaped our recommendations on trauma-informed care, recovery-focused regimes, and continuity of supply on release. And I want to put on record my personal thanks to all of those who spoke to us. Turning to alcohol use. Now, evidence shows that 63% of people in prison have an alcohol use disorder and 40% report being drunk at the time of their offence. Yet specialist alcohol referrals remain strikingly low in comparison to need. Alcohol may be less visible in custody than synthetic drugs, but its role in offending, harm and post-release mortality is significant. We recognise the exceptional strain on the prison estate. Overcrowding, high turnover and workforce pressures were repeatedly cited as barriers to effective prevention and early intervention. Without protected time for purposeful activity, therapeutic work and consistent staff engagement, progress will always be fragile. Now, I welcome the Scottish Government and Scottish Prison Services joint initial assessment of our recommendations and the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to continued engagement on this issue. The response highlights important work already underway: the target operating model for prison healthcare, alignment of the SPS alcohol and drug recovery strategy with the mental health strategy, implementation of MAT standards, recovery cafes, the operational regime and roster review, and action to manage population pressures. All extremely important work. Now, these are significant steps, but our inquiry requires us to ask if the frameworks that exist are delivering consistently across the estate. So, for example, the government response emphasises that prison healthcare must be equivalent to community standards. Yet witnesses did describe variability between health boards in staffing levels, access to therapies and clinical capacity. On early intervention, the government notes alignment between strategies. However, our report recommends a custody-focused prevention and early intervention framework that explicitly integrates mental health and substance use services from admission right through to release. Integration is essential. And on accountability, the government indicates that existing reporting structures will provide updates. The committee's position is that Parliament must be able to track measurable outcomes, reductions in drug-related deaths, improved access to treatment and increased engagement in recovery work. And one of the strongest areas of consensus during this inquiry was this: substance misuse in prisons is fundamentally a public health issue with criminal justice consequences. If we treat it as a security problem, we will chase supply endlessly. If we treat it as an individual failing, we will ignore structural drivers. But if we treat it as a health issue embedded within a justice context, we have a chance to reduce harm meaningfully. This report contains 50 recommendations across 6 themes. They are practical, evidence-based and cross-party, and they acknowledge the dedication of staff. They recognise financial and operational constraints, but they are also clear that incremental change will not be enough. Now, this debate is not about just highlighting gaps and shortcomings. It is about ensuring that custody does not deepen addiction and that release does not mark the beginning of a renewed crisis. The measure of our justice system is not only how securely it confines people, but whether it reduces harm, improves health and strengthens community safety in the long term. That is the standard this report sets, and I commend it to Parliament and I move the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Nicholl. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance to open on behalf of the Scottish Government. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and my thanks to Audrey Nicholl in her capacity as convener of the Criminal Justice Committee. And I want to start by echoing the committee's conclusion that a public health approach is desirable, and what we see as a public health approach, but with justice consequences. And it's imperative that we absolutely interrupt the supply of drugs, but we also need to continue our work to reduce the demand of drugs through prevention, treatment, recovery and tackling stigma. And that applies in the community, and it should also apply in our prison establishments. So I very much welcome the committee's inquiry into the harm caused by substance misuse in our prisons, its report, and the opportunity to debate the key issues and reflect on the impact these have on those living and working in prisons. And Ms Todd and I were very pleased to be able to attend committee last year to support the inquiry during its evidence gathering and consideration. And I would like to thank all who participated in the inquiry, and I note the committee's appreciation of the informal, private engagement of people with lived and living experience of substance misuse in prison and family members affected by imprisonment. And such insights are hugely valuable and help shape meaningful improvements. And I also have to acknowledge and show my appreciation to the briefings provided by the Prison Officers Association and the Scottish Health for Action on Alcohol Problems. And I say to both those organisations that the issues they raise will continue to be a feature in my endeavours and the discussions that I have with the Scottish Prison Service leadership. As Ms Nicholl highlighted, we have provided a joint initial response from the Scottish Government and the Scottish Prison Service to the committee's recommendations, which I do hope is helpful to members. I recognise the importance of the areas identified by the committee, including ensuring prevention and early intervention are fully integrated into approaches within custody as much as possible, and the support people receive is equitable with that in the community. And as Parliament is aware and the committee has recognised, we have a high and increasingly complex prison population. Preventing supply, keeping people safe and managing the impact of substance use in prisons places a significant demand on the prison service, our NHS colleagues and other partners. And I am grateful for the hard work and dedication of all those staff in all of those organisations to keep people in our care and their colleagues safe. We are investing just over £1 billion in our prisons to support frontline staff and progress improvements in the prison estate in 26-27, and this includes an uplift of nearly £21 million of resource to the Scottish Prison Service, bringing the total resource budget to over £509 million. And this will help meet costs linked to the changing prison population and enable the prison service to continue to deliver a safe and secure system. And SPS are working to make the best use of capacity. Reducing the risks that lead people to developing new drug dependencies in prison is a priority, and the introduction of the operational regime and roster review will protect purposeful activity and time out of cell by ensuring that staff are available at peak times. Presiding Officer, I have kept Parliament updated on the critical issues in relation to the prison population and the actions taken and pursued that have been or are, in my view, essential, ensuring the safe running of the estate for those in custody and our hard-working staff. And I've also set out to Parliament the Government's initial response to the Sentencing and Penal Commission, which was published earlier this month. The Commission have provided an opportunity for Parliament to make bold, evidence-based changes across the justice system with a renewed focus on prevention and reducing re-offending, and how that will lead to better outcomes for individuals and communities and our justice system as a whole. We know that people in prison often face significant disadvantage, including complex health needs, and we are committed with NHS, SPS and others to ensuring healthcare, as I said, is at least as equivalent to that available in the community. And the committee rightly highlights the importance of mental health services, alcohol services and healthcare more generally, and we support that position. The importance of rehabilitation and supported transitions from custody is also highlighted, and that's why we are investing £5.3 million each year in Upside, a voluntary through care service to support short-term offenders or those on remand leaving prison. And we also value greatly the role of third sector providers, both in prison and in the community. There is an increasing shared understanding of the harmful and evolving nature of illegal drug supply in prisons, including concerns about the rise and strength of synthetic drugs, their impact on people in custody and on staff, and the importance of access to effective rehabilitation and support. These are issues that I discuss with the Chief Executive of the Prison Service, and the Prison Service are managing that highly complex environment, and I do welcome the committee's report, which will help inform further action to support people in our care, keep staff safe and improve those crucial transitions. And all of this will sit within the Prison Service 10-year alcohol and drug strategy published last year, which provides the framework for improving outcomes. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'm very encouraged by the level of cross-party support on these issues. It is clear that the work required to reduce harm from substance use in prisons and in the community will need ongoing cross-party support and a continued focus in the new Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Sharon Dowie to open on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's prison estate does not have its troubles to seek. Inmate numbers are at record levels, staff are reporting unprecedented challenges, and prisoners are leaving without rehabilitation, out and into a world for which they're completely unprepared. What's worse, the estate itself is in deep trouble. Promised new jails for Glasgow and the Highlands are years late and ludicrously over budget. But today's debate focuses on yet another challenge, and one which this Scottish Government has failed miserably to address: the issue of substance misuse, which creates chaos inside and places unbearable stress and pressure on hard-working prison officers. The crisis damages the prospects of inmates too. For many, incarceration is supposed to serve as a punishment for what they have done and a deterrent not to repeat that behaviour, but it is also supposed to provide rehabilitation. They should have new skills, a new attitude and perhaps even an enthusiasm for the future where there will be a well-functioning, contributing member of society. And yet, Presiding Officer, the culture of drug-taking in prisons is stopping so much of that happening. The public rightly expect jails to be secure facilities where the only things which get in and out are approved people and products. Perhaps small errors could be accepted, but the scale of drugs and alcohol inside is eye-watering, and those criminals who succeed in getting the contraband in seem to constantly be a step ahead of the authorities. They use drones, drug-soaked mail, and essentially any trick they can to do this. Scotland's drug deaths crisis is well documented, but the one place people should be absolutely free of its clutches is within a secure state facility. We know, of course, that many inmates turn up to prison addicted to drugs or alcohol, and their addiction probably contributed to their crime. But one of the most worrying statistics I've heard during this inquiry is that many prisoners report developing addiction for the first time while in jail. Upon leaving prison, some surveys indicate between 1/4 and 1/3 have illegal substances in their body. So how have we got to this shocking situation? Scotland's high prison population is one reason. Bursting at the seams, the inadequate estate, staffed by fatigued and stressed out prison officers, creates an environment more likely to descend into chaos. Those pressures leave staff with less time to work in intelligence and investigate where the drugs are getting in and who is taking them. Underinvestment in activities also means prisoners are bored and driven to revisit previous substance abuse habits. Presiding Officer, much of the focus is on drugs, but we should not overlook the issue of alcohol. Around a third of prisoners are thought to be alcohol dependent. Not only are they not offered enough help to beat that addiction in jail, it's too easy for them to access illicit alcohol while serving their sentence. Nobody's pretending there are easy answers to this. As the Prison Officers Association states, the system is under pressure like never before. The blend of prisoners, foreigners, organised criminals, ageing offenders serving sentences for historic crime creates a nightmare. But there is so much more that the SNP government could have done. There are numerous solutions being put forward from a wide variety of sources. The Scottish Prison Service is clearly understaffed and under-resourced. One of the main reasons prisoners have appointments for substance misuse issues cancelled is because of a lack of staff cover. There is also an inconsistent approach to things like peer groups, which have been shown to work, and various other support services. These things will never improve unless funding improves. Staff representatives have also come forward with ideas such as anti-drone fences around jails, which would stop a major carrier of contraband. Perhaps the SNP government could break the habit of a lifetime and start working with the UK government to see if there are any nationwide solutions to these problems. The Union for Prison Officers has been clear that many of these things aren't being pursued, and I quote, because of funding constraints. Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has not listened to the people who know best, and its attitude has been lax and complacent. That is why we are where we are today. The Government must urgently restore control in Scotland's prisons, or the whole of society will continue to pay a heavy price. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. I now call on Polly McNeill to open on behalf of Scottish Labour. Up to 4 minutes, Ms McNeill.
The committee launches inquiry because repeated investigations, powerful testimony from families and staff and the findings of the People's Panel, which all showed that Scotland's prisons are facing systematic failure in responding to substance misuse. Witnesses told the committee that in their view, prisons have become de facto holding environments for people whose core needs in relation to substance addictions are more clinical than criminal. So the committee concluded that without acknowledging the underlying health shortcomings and the efforts to reduce drug-related harm in custody, it will continue to fall short. The nature of the problem is complex, but it begins with Scotland's prisons being severely overcrowded and understaffed. Low staffing levels increase the risk of incidents and do limit time for meaningful engagement with prisoners. The unpredictable behaviour associated with synthetic drug intoxication means that officers are very often the first responders to emergency situations. But I was struck by the sessions with prisoners speaking candidly about drug use in prisons and in their experiences. There was one ex-prisoner who had been given a 7-year sentence but had served 19 years due to not being able to cope without using drugs, and that's why he was in for so long. But others in the group said that the trauma that they felt after reflecting on their crimes led them to taking drugs when they were in prison, where they had previously not. But this lack of meaningful activity is definitely a factor. As one prison officer put it, at Glenorchy and other prisons, there is little to stimulate or engage prisoners, so no wonder they take drugs. Police Scotland also provided a major clue to the nature of the problem when it said that many of the same networks control both community and prison drug markets, using prisons to maintain influence and collect debts, a point that the convener made in her opening speech. The public often wonder how drugs still reach our prisons, and it's probably one of the reasons why the committee tried to delve into this a bit further. The reality, as you've heard so far, is that there are many routes into prisons, and the increased use of drones where drugs are brought in that way, and the impregnated parcels, small parcels brought in through various means, including visitors. On our visit to HMP Edinburgh, we were able to view the grids that had been installed to prevent drones passing through or near windows. But as one prisoner pointed out, there are some very clever people in jail, but it's only a matter of time before they find a way around that. So there are very serious concerns about the use of drones, and in fact, to the point where the concerns about the capability of drones to carry weapons. The Scottish Prison Service and other witnesses frequently told the committee that synthetic cannabinoids known as spice are the most serious and current threat to safety and well-being in the prison estate. And a recent survey of prison officers associated, Prisoners Association said that 40% to 75% of offenders reported a drug problem or tested positive for illegal substances entering prison. One officer noted that the physical risks to officers caused by drug taking, especially drugs like spice, that drugs are affecting prisoners psychologically, causing them to attack officers. So you can see there is a real and live issue in our Scottish prisons. So it comes as no surprise that those in the front line of this current situation, prison officers are reporting low morale. So it is vital that we turn this situation around. One of our committee recommendations is that there should be a national standard for pre-release healthcare. Planning should be introduced. It's been well known by successive committees that unless a government plans for support for prisoners who've had drug addiction and other related health problems when they are released from prison, they will continue to reoffend. And it's about time that there was a government who was able to take that on. Is it any wonder that our offending rates are so sky high? This has to be a priority for whoever forms the next government. I thank the clerks for their support during this important work that we've been doing, and I hope that this report will be a useful report for the next Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. I now call on Maggie Chapman to open on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to begin by thanking the Criminal Justice Committee for its work on this inquiry. The evidence they heard and included in their report is sobering, urgent and, frankly, politically and morally challenging. So let's begin with the reality. Nearly 2/3 of people in our prisons have alcohol use disorder. Around 40% were drunk at the time of their offence. Yet referrals to specialist alcohol services remain vanishingly small compared to the scale of need. That's not simply a service gap, it's a political choice. The committee's report makes clear that substance misuse in prison is not an isolated problem. It is the predictable outcome of trauma, poverty, inequality, and a system that too often warehouses distress rather than responding to it. If we are serious about justice, we must be serious about public health. Prisons are currently being asked to manage what are fundamentally health crises. Overcrowding, extended lockup, lack of purposeful activity and fractured mental health provision create conditions in which substances become coping mechanisms. And when alcohol is less available, we see substitution with synthetic drugs, often more dangerous, more unpredictable and more harmful. And prison officers are left to pick up the pieces, whether or not they've had appropriate training or have the right PPE. This isn't about individual moral failure, it's about systemic neglect. The Scottish Greens support the committee's recommendations on consistent assessment, closing the treatment gap, strengthening pre-release planning and improving continuity of care. But we must also be honest, implementing these recommendations within the current scale of imprisonment will only ever be a sticking plaster. Scotland imprisons too many people. Many of them are there for short sentences linked to poverty, addiction or low-level offending. We know short custodial sentences are ineffective, destabilising and criminogenic, yet we continue to rely on them. If 63% of the prison population has alcohol use disorder, that is not a prison problem. That is a public health emergency playing out behind bars. So we should be dramatically expanding community-based disposals with robust treatment requirements. We should be embedding trauma-informed care across the justice system. We should be piloting prison-based overdose prevention centres. We should ensure medication-assisted treatment is universally and proactively available, not just for opioids, but for alcohol dependence as well. And we must guarantee that no one leaves custody without housing, healthcare registration, a prescription, if required, and a live appointment in the community. The weeks after release are the most dangerous, and we cannot continue to discharge people into homelessness and expect recovery to follow. But I think we should go further. We must confront the uncomfortable truth that incarceration itself can deepen harm. When women leaving prison are 9 times more likely to die from alcohol-related causes than the general population, that demands more than incremental reform. It demands transformation. Justice must mean healing. It must mean restoration. It must mean addressing the root causes of harm rather than simply punishing its symptoms. This report gives us a roadmap. The question for Parliament is whether we are brave enough to follow it, not just by tweaking services, but by reimagining what justice looks like in Scotland. The Scottish Greens, I know, stand ready to support action that treats substance use as a health issue, reduces our reliance on imprisonment and centres dignity, compassion and evidence. Because if we truly believe that people can change, then our system must change too. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. We will now move to the open debate. Backbench speeches of around 4 minutes. I call Elena Whittam to be followed by Mark Griffin. Ms Whittam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the Criminal Justice Committee's report on substance use in Scotland's prisons, and I thank them for their care in ensuring lived and living experience is at its heart. The evidence heard was consistent and compelling. Substance use in custody is a public health issue with justice consequences. Drug and alcohol use in prison does not begin at the prison gates. It reflects trauma, poverty, inequality and untreated mental distress that long predate imprisonment. If we fail to address those drivers, prisons will continue to absorb unmet health and social needs they were never designed to manage. And the committee is clear that enforcement is necessary, but it's not sufficient. Order and safety matter, and we must commend the sustained professionalism of prison officers, healthcare staff and police who work in extremely challenging circumstances, often facing consequences of organised crime and drug-related emergencies on a daily basis. And as we've heard, especially in relation to potent spice and synthetic opioids in circulation. But punishment does not deliver recovery. Overcrowding is a fundamental barrier to progress. High population levels restrict access to purposeful activity, reduce therapeutic space, compress staff time and disrupt continuity of care. And if we're serious about prevention and early intervention, we must recognise that sustainable reforms depend on reducing the pressures created by an overcrowded estate, and that community justice is not soft justice, but smart justice. The committee recommends a custody-focused prevention and early intervention framework, one that embeds trauma-informed care, properly links mental health and substance use services, and supports recovery right from admission through to release. Crucially, the same standards must apply in custody as in the community, and treatment should not stop when someone enters prisons, nor collapse when they leave. And we've already heard that highlighted. Parity of mental health provision is essential. Addiction must never be a barrier to accessing mental health care. People in custody should have timely assessment, access to talking therapies, trauma-specific intervention, peer recovery groups, and integrated treatment for co-occurring conditions. The report also calls for strengthened rights-based information and advocacy, consistent family contact, including digital access and phone calls. This is really important, and that's not a soft thing either. Contact with your family on the outside is vital for well-being. We also need expanded anti-stigma training for staff and a guaranteed baseline of purposeful activity across the estate. And Parliament must be able to monitor progress through clear and regular reporting. On supply and security, the committee accepts that total interdiction is unrealistic in an era of synthetic drugs. Technology absolutely has a role, but it must complement and not replace relationship-based security and investment in staff. Organised crime groups exploit vulnerability within prisons, and that must be tackled as part of wider national strategies. But we cannot measure success by seizures alone. We must reduce harm and we must reduce demand. We also must continue to ensure that testing of substances that are seized help to reduce harms in their ever-evolving market that we have. Disciplinary responses must also be proportionate. There's a clear distinction between organised criminal supply and personal use-rooted independency. The latter requires a health-led response, not simply further punishment. Presiding Officer, alcohol, as we've heard, is all too often forgotten crisis within our justice system. And as we've heard from the convener and Maggie Chapman, only around 1.1% of the prison population have been referred to specialist alcohol services. And for me, that's a stark treatment gap. Whilst withdrawal management on admission is generally effective, support during the remainder of prison sentences are inconsistent. Continuity of care on release is variable. The consequences are grave. The risk of death from alcohol causes is 3 times higher for men who have been in prison, and as we've heard, 9 times higher for women compared to the general population. And the weeks and months following a release are a period of acute vulnerability. Scottish Health Action on alcohol problems supports the committee's recommendations and calls for a national service specification with clear standards for alcohol treatment in justice settings. And I agree. Without clear national standards, inequality and inconsistency will persist. The committee's overarching conclusion is simple but profound. Substance-related harm in Scotland's prisons reflects wider systemic failures. If policy truly aligns with the principle that substance use is a public health issue with justice consequences, then health, prevention and recovery must be embedded in every aspect of prison life, from healthcare and security to purposeful activity, recovery-focused opportunities and reintegration. And I do welcome all of the work that's currently underway to bring this to reality. And I would like to take a moment to make mention of all the organisations who are going into our prisons on a daily basis to facilitate recovery opportunities. We owe the likes of Minds of Recovery and Recovery Enterprises in Ayrshire who go into HMP Kilmarnock offering connection and hope, a debt of gratitude and all of our support.
I'm afraid that the member is concluding.
Yeah. If we want safer communities, fewer deaths and lower reoffending, we must ensure that our prisons are places where recovery is supported, dignity is upheld and reintegration is real. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Whittam. Could I remind all members who are wishing to speak in the debate to please ensure that they have in fact pressed the request to speak buttons. And I call Mark Griffin to be followed by Rona Mackay. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In reading the findings of the Criminal Justice Committee's inquiry into the harm caused by substance misuse in Scottish prisons, it's clear that this issue isn't just a justice problem, it's also a public health issue with far-reaching consequences for individuals, families and communities. Substance misuse in prison reflects deeper issues like poverty, trauma, inequality and untreated mental health needs. And those needs often begin long before imprisonment and are made worse by the prison environment. Points made by multiple speakers in a debate this afternoon. But overcrowding, limited access to mental health services and a lack of purposeful activity create conditions that amplify harm in Scottish prisons. When I visited Berlin a number of years ago now, the then Governor told me, in his words, that the prison had the biggest methadone queue in Europe. And speaking to some of the men in custody, a lot of them ended up telling me the same story over and over, that they didn't take drugs or methadone before prison. They told me that life in prison with no access to courses or meaningful training due to overcrowding or because they were on remand and didn't get access meant that they spent the vast majority of time in a cell completely bored, and so that they felt the best and the only option for them was to take drugs, pass out and use that to pass the time. Now, that speaks to a justice system almost forcing people onto drugs just to pass the time of day.
Audrey Nicholl.
The member for giving way. I was going to intervene on my colleague Eleanor Whittam. It's just on the point of purposeful activity, which has been raised probably by all members. And I've had the privilege over the years to fairly regularly visit HMP Grampian, and they provide some absolutely wonderful purposeful activity. One of the issues and the challenges that they have is access to third sector funding. Obviously, many of these organisations are external organisations that come in. So it's just to put that on the record that, you know, it's not just the issues around overcrowding and such that are a challenge around purposeful activity.
Thank you, Ms Griffin. I'll give you your time back.
Thank you. I appreciate the points that Audrey Nicholl has made. The points made to me by prison management were that those issues were down to overcrowding. It was down to issue with those on remand not qualifying for the kind of purposeful activity courses that we're talking about, and also the numbers on remand in prison exacerbating the overcrowding issues as well, and those remand figures causing real problems. But the committee report highlights that enforcement measures alone won't solve this crisis, and I think security measures like body scanners, anti-drone technology are clearly very important. We do need to tackle supply, but that has to be matched as well with prevention, treatment and recovery services. We need that whole system approach. And mental health care clearly needs improvement too. Many individuals in custody struggle with mental health and substance use disorders, but their access, like Elena Whittam pointed out, their access to treatment becomes inconsistent. That parity between the treatment that they received outside of prison, community health care, and what they receive in prison actually start to exacerbate the mental health issues that a lot of people have. Also, the transition from custody to community is a period of heightened risk for overdose, relapse and reoffending. Every person leaving prison, and again coming back to that issue of those on remand who are sometimes don't go through a planned release programme, but every single person who leaves prison should have a comprehensive release plan, including housing, healthcare and support services, because without that cycle of addiction, reoffending, imprisonment will just carry on. I also wanted to touch on something that many members have said as well. Again, that importance of having that lived experience in shaping poverty. That afternoon, that day I spent in Berlin, walking around the prison, talking to so many people in there just about their experience of how they ended up there, what life was like, what was causing them to come back over and over was so important and so crucial for gathering evidence and making policy. But, Presiding Officer, addressing substance misuse in Scottish prison does require systemic reform. We need to break down barriers between justice and health systems, invest in prevention and treatment, and ensure that prisons become places of rehabilitation rather than a revolving door. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. And I call Rona Mackay. Ms Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Criminal Justice Committee's inquiry into substance abuse in prisons was at times harrowing, often emotional when the committee met affected prisoners, and ultimately extremely concerning in many levels. It is a fact that our prisons, along with those in the rest of the UK, are overcrowded and substance abuse is rife among them.
Not surprisingly, this impacts on prisoners, overworked staff and the families of offenders. Our inquiry highlighted the need for early intervention and, of course, an emphasis on tackling the wider societal issues around the root cause of substance misuse before imprisonment. We know that substance use leads to severe health risks, including overdoses and mental health deterioration. Within the prison environment, a setting where people are forced to live together 24/7 with multiple mental health and trauma issues, it can be catastrophic. Boredom and trauma are significant factors driving substance use in prisons. The current overcrowding means structured activities like education and exercise, which help to reduce boredom, are unable to take place. Many prisoners report limited access to those activities and are unable to leave their cells for hours due to lack of programming and the staff available to supervise. Presiding Officer, questions must be asked about the number of short-term sentences being issued and, in fact, the whole purpose of prison. Serious offenders who are at risk to others or themselves should, of course, be incarcerated, but too many people, including women suffering from trauma and health issues or are victims of domestic abuse, are being locked up for minor offences. This must stop. Prison wrecks families, it blights children's lives and rarely acts as a deterrent to offending. The excellent organisation Families Outside are a godsend to those families trying to cope with the multiple effects of imprisonment. Families face emotional and financial strain due to a loved one's substance use and imprisonment, and lack of information and often communication from the prison exacerbates family distress and complicates relationships. The committee learned about the drug supply and entry of drugs into prisons. Synthetic cannabinoids and benzodiazepines are the most detected substances and can be fatal due to the inability to gauge quality or strength. Psychoactive drugs cause terror among staff and inmates due to aggression and erratic behaviour that they cause. And during our prison visits, as we've heard, we saw a variety of items used to smuggle drugs into prisons, and drones are becoming increasingly common. Technology is struggling to keep pace with inventive ways criminals are getting access to drugs. Presiding Officer, despite the extreme challenge faced by prison and healthcare staff, work is being done to help prisoners battle addiction. Recovery hubs and peer-led activities are emerging in prisons, but availability can vary due to staffing and operational pressures. The fact is, however, that stigma surrounding substance use and imprisonment can create barriers to seeking support, and we do know that peer-led support is essential for fostering a recovery culture within prisons. Harm reduction measures, including education and naloxone provision, are also essential for public health in prisons. However, the implementation of the medication-assisted treatment, or the MAT standards, can be inconsistent across prisons. And as the convener mentioned, dual diagnosis between addiction and mental health issues is something that needs to be addressed. Funding and resources are critical for effective adherence to MAT standards, and a lack of clarity on how they apply in prison settings can complicate their implementation. Quick access to medication, especially opioid substitution therapy, is vital on admission to prison. It's been linked to reduced drug-related deaths post-release, emphasising its importance in treatment. I want to conclude, Presiding Officer, by stressing the support that is needed after release from prison. Those first few weeks are critical. Many individuals face homelessness, and of course this increases the risk of relapse. Effective through-care planning is essential to ensure successful reintegration into the community. But the Scottish Government is committed to ensuring this happens and to constantly monitor the issue of drug misuse in prisons. Thank you.
Thank you. We now move to closing speeches. I call on Michael Chapman to close on behalf of the Scottish Greens. Up to 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has reinforced something many of us already knew. Substance misuse in prison is not incidental. It is endemic. And it reflects deeper failures long before someone reaches the prison gate, as Eleanor Whittam highlighted. We've heard about the treatment gap, hundreds entering custody with alcohol dependence each year, yet only a fraction receiving specialist support. We've heard about substitution into synthetic drugs. We've heard about the spike in deaths after release. Behind every statistic is a person, often someone who has experienced trauma, violence, poverty or care experience. Too many are criminalised for behaviours rooted in unmet need. The committee report sets out clear, practical recommendations, validated assessment tools, scaling up specialist services, strengthening pre-release planning, improving continuity of care and expanding treatment conditions in community disposals. These must be implemented in full and without delay. But we should not mistake implementation for completion. If prisons remain overcrowded, if remand continues to be overused, if short sentences persist for low-level offending, then we will continue to recycle people through systems that exacerbate instability, harm and ill health. As Eleanor Whittam said, such punishment cannot support recovery. The Scottish Greens believe we must reduce the prison population as a matter of urgency, not recklessly, but responsibly and evidence-led. We must stop locking up people, especially women, as Rona Mackay has highlighted, who do not pose risk to others. Instead, we must invest in community justice, invest in housing first, invest in mental health and addiction services that people can access without entering the justice system at all. But for those who are incarcerated, they need the staff who support them to have the support, training and equipment they need. As Pauline McNeill and others have recognised, staff should not have their own health and safety compromised as a consequence of incidents involving substance misuse. We should also be bold in harm reduction. Universal access to medication-assisted treatment, consideration of supervised consumption models in custodial settings, naloxone provision that is opt-out rather than opt-in, peer-led recovery communities embedded in every establishment. Incarceration should not be a barrier to healthcare, whether that is medical or psychological support that is needed and then provided. And above all, we must guarantee that liberation from prison does not mean abandonment by the state. No one should leave custody to homelessness. No one should leave without healthcare continuity. No one should leave without a plan, as Mark Griffin and others have highlighted. Justice that ends at the prison gate is not justice. It is abdication. Before I conclude, Presiding Officer, I'd like to place on record my thanks for the work of the Prison Officers Association on this important issue and for their briefing for today's debate. I'm grateful too for the information the Scottish Health Action on Alcohol Problems provided. Presiding Officer, this committee report shines a light on a crisis that has been hidden for too long. The real test now is political will. Will we treat substance use as the health issue it is? Will we invest upstream rather than paying downstream? Will we choose restoration over retribution? The Scottish Greens will continue to push for a justice system rooted in compassion, accountability and care, one that understands that healing communities requires healing people. Because if we want safer communities, we must build healthier and more equal ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call on Michael Mara to close on behalf of Scottish Labour. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I place on record a declaration of interest as the former Deputy Director of the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science at the University of Dundee, who submitted evidence to the inquiry and are represented in the report. And I would like to begin by paying tribute to the work of my former colleagues. They have worked since 2019 with the Scottish Prison Service to help us to understand the nature of the substances that are being consumed in our prison estate, and also some of the method of delivery. As in managing some of those members of staff, I'm certainly having the chemical expertise in order to do the analysis myself, but in working with them, I was always struck by the ingenuity of some of the prison population to actually get these materials into the prison estate. And I think we've heard that from various members today. And Pauline McNeill, I think, raised a very good point about this, that the public really do, I think, struggle to understand how this is possible, how you can have drugs and alcohol at such levels in the prison estate. And so I think actually this report does a service to beginning to build some of that public understanding and policy understanding around how you deal with those issues. I mean, this is no panopticon, as theorised by Foucault, about a cruel, ingenious cage in terms of the idealised prison that presents and creates the docile beings. And it's a world away from that. It's a continuous conflict between policing of the prison estate and people who are trying to access these substances within it. And it's a constant battle. I thought that Elena Whittam put that very well and said that any technological approach must sit alongside a relationship-based stewardship of our prison estate. We just cannot solve these problems, even though, as Mark Griffin highlighted, some of the technologies that can be put in place. We have to recognise that there will be a duality to the approach that is in this, absolutely, and that's absolutely key. I was struck by some of the respondent around purposeful activity. And it's absolutely clear that actually the conditions of imprisonment is what people are attempting to escape from in the less literal sense, to try and absent themselves from the mental drudgery and torture that they see in their daily lives. But people who are typically young men in prison want to learn skills. Many of them want to learn joinery, want to learn to be brickies, want to think that they might have a better life and a possibility for themselves and their family outside of the door. And Audrey Nicholl talked about the third sector organisations outside. And I would gently say to her that, this at a time when IJBs are being gutted by this government. Absolutely gutted. So the third sector that is so reliant on our integrated joint boards across Scotland, the level of cuts that we're seeing across the North East, I know in particular in Dundee, are absolutely severe, and we should recognise that. Both Sharon Dow and Mark Griffin touched on the issues of first-time addicts in the prison estate. And again, that, I think, to the public is a horrific thought, that people are going into prison and becoming addicts. But we know that that is the case, again, for some of the reasons that I have set out. And we also know, though, that as a result of that, when people exit the prison gate, they are far more at risk of overdose in terms of the availability and the potency of drugs that are available in the outside world. We have to make sure in our national drugs deaths crisis, a source of huge shame and regret for the country and for this government, that we have to deal with these things absolutely directly and appropriately. And I think that touches on this issue of dual diagnosis as well, in terms of the issue about mental health and addiction and how our public services are dealing with that. I know that in the conclusions of the Dundee Drugs Commission, which I was involved with, the issue of dual diagnosis was presented all those years ago and remains a massive problem in our locality, in terms of how people recognise that they, as professionals, that the people have dual diagnosis and which service they have to access. But all of these problems, Presiding Officer, are exacerbated by what is a chaotic prison policy that has descended into chaos under this government.
Thank you, Mr Mara. I now call on Sue Webber to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. Around 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thought you'd forgotten about me. Apologies for that. Under the SNP, Scotland's prisons have become warehouses for addiction. This inquiry lays bare a system that's overcrowded, understaffed and completely out of control. Drugs are rife, alcohol dependency is ignored and lives are being lost behind bars at an alarming rate. So let's be clear. If you don't mind, Ms Constance, I won't be, if that's all right on this. I'm a last-minute addition to the speaking. Okay. Let's be clear. Well, perhaps I will, as I get a bit of through my speeches. I've literally just had 4 lines. Prison should be a place of punishment, yes, but it must also be a place of recovery. And right now, it is neither. The facts are damning. Over a third of prisoners now admit to using illegal drugs in custody. 1 in 4 say their drug use started or increased inside prison. And drone drops have exploded from just 6 incidents to more than 70 in 3 years. Nearly 15,000 drug recoveries have been recorded. That's not harm reduction, it's institutional failure. This breeding ground, in combination with a lack of vital rehabilitation services, means that prisoners are not being set up properly for release and are not given the very best chance at kick-starting their new life. Instead, they're more likely to relapse, reoffend, as the right support is not available. And alcohol misuse is being treated as an afterthought. Around 5,000 people enter custody every year with an alcohol dependency, yet last year only 167 were referred for treatment. So that's not a gap in provision, it's a collapse in basic care. Is it any wonder that deaths in custody are soaring? We've seen 64 deaths in Scottish prisons in a single year, a 60% increase. And researchers have identified repeated preventable failures, missed cell checks, health concerns dismissed as drug-seeking, mental health crises ignored until it's far too late. This isn't just about drugs, it's about control. Overcrowding and staff shortages have allowed the prison drugs market to adapt faster than the system meant to stop it. Potent synthetic drugs like spice are driving violence, psychosis and medical emergencies, putting prisoners and staff at serious risk. And while the chaos unfolds, SNP ministers talk about compassion but deliver complacency. They fund programmes but don't track outcomes. They announce pathways to rehab but can't say whether people recover. Since 2022, just 48 people have completed a 12-week residential rehabilitation placement through prison to rehab. 48. This is not a solution, it's tokenism. This government is obsessed with managing addiction, not ending it. And we see it in our communities, and now we see it in our prisons. Instead of expanding access to meaningful, structured rehabilitation, the SNP has allowed prisons to become holding pens for people with complex addictions, releasing them back into society, no safer, no healthier, and no more hopeful than when they entered. This is failing victims, it's failing communities, and it's failing prisoners themselves. The Scottish Conservatives believe in something different, because we believe recovery must be the goal, not just survival. So we will continue to argue for the right to recovery, including access to residential rehabilitation for those who need it, in custody or on release. Because without treatment, without stability and without proper support, the cycle of addiction, crime and custody will never be broken. This inquiry should be a wake-up call. Ministers must stop pretending the crisis is under control. They must restore order in prisons, properly resource staff, clamp down on supply and, crucially, guarantee access to treatment that actually works. Presiding Officer, because prisons should not be places where addiction festers. They should be places where lives are turned around. And until this government understands that, the drugs crisis inside and outside prison walls will continue on their watch. Enough excuses. Start delivering recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. I call on the Minister.
I'd like to start by thanking all the committee members for their contributions to the debate. Drug and alcohol use in prison is a public health challenge as well as a justice one, and it's pleasing to hear so many of the members reflect that in their speeches. It's clear that this is an issue which members have given a lot of considered thought to, and the recommendations produced in this report are, in the main, ones which continue to take us in the direction which we are travelling. There are others, though, that will require an incoming administration to take forward. As the Cabinet Secretary said, we both welcomed the opportunity to provide evidence to the committee last September. That provided us with the opportunity to make the committee aware of some of the great work that's been carried out by the Scottish Prison Service and health staff to support those with drug or alcohol use issues, and I'm pleased that the committee recognises those efforts. As I told the committee, although the number of people in prison who lose their life from drugs is relatively small, the fact is that 2/5 of those in prison self-reported problematic drug use prior to imprisonment. Many of the contributions have recognised the scale of alcohol-related need in prison, and I'm very grateful for the briefing that came from SHAP, and I look forward to meeting with them to discuss these issues further before Parliament dissolves. Prison should therefore be somewhere where these issues are dealt with sensitively and effectively. As the Scottish Prison Service's alcohol and drug strategy outlines, we need to treat substance use as a public health issue and ensure that the care provided is at the very minimum equivalent to the care provided in the community. We're driving improvement work for prison healthcare through a target operating model, which includes improvements in actions for alcohol and drug services. The Public Health Scotland-based MAT implementation support team is also continuing to work to deliver a programme of support for justice and custodial settings. The standards reinforce a rights-based approach for people and the treatment that they should expect regardless of the circumstances or where they are. In terms of recovery work, we are continuing to provide funding to the third sector to embed a person-centred recovery-focused approach benefiting prisoners, families and staff. This continues into the transition and resettlement back into the community. Recovery initiatives are now in place across all prisons in Scotland, and I am pleased that the committee has recognised the importance of that work. The committee has also recognised the importance of harm reduction measures. With naloxone, we have a treatment that can reverse the effects of opiate overdose. We've expanded access to all prisons, and we're funding the Scottish Drugs Forum to deliver peer-to-peer naloxone supply for prisoners within the estate. We also made national mission funding available to develop residential rehabilitation services and that associated aftercare that allows access to residential rehabilitation immediately on release from prison. That prison to rehab pathway enables individuals to access residential rehabilitation immediately on release from prison. But it is for individual prisoners to consider whether that is a path they want to follow. But if it's one they choose, we will fund that pathway. As the national mission comes to an end, we remain committed to reducing harm and to improving lives. We've been working very closely with stakeholders, including people with lived and living experience, to develop a new alcohol and drug strategy to follow the mission. This strategy will be published in the coming weeks, but I can say that our commitment in this area will be evident. In closing, I'd like to repeat my thanks to the committee for their diligence in producing this considered and thoughtful report. I am pleased that they saw evidence from those directly affected and they visited establishments. I think it is clear from the tone of the report and from its recommendations that strengthens our evidence base and drives work forward in this important area. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call on Liam Kerr on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee to wind up the debate.
Yeah, thank you, Presiding Officer. And in closing, on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee, I observe that a key function of the committee system in a unicameral parliament is to be independent of government and party. And at the outset, I think it's important to put on record that in producing this report, I think the committee has largely fulfilled that objective to its great credit. And I think on that it's important to credit the clerks and the advisers to the committee for facilitating and assisting with such a detailed and comprehensive inquiry. And of course, also to all those who gave evidence, who facilitated visits and very candidly opened up on their experiences and challenges. This inquiry was detailed. It was cross-party, and as I think it was Rona Mackay said, it was at times pretty difficult. It was pretty harrowing. It examined evidence from government, from the Scottish Prison Service, from NHS representatives, from third sector organisations, prison officers, and those who've experienced addiction whilst in custody. You see, Presiding Officer, I think we start from a common position in many ways. Scotland's prisons are at capacity. They are overcrowded. They face considerable challenges, which, as many have pointed out today, have consequences. Now, the respective parties in this report, and indeed speaking in the Chamber today, will have very different perspectives on why that is the case and what the response to that should be. But I think we're united in our conclusions that Scotland's prisons do face a public health emergency. And it's one driven by trauma, it is one driven by inequality, it is one driven by mental health deficits and evolving drug markets. Now, our report found that drug use in prisons was widespread and that substance misuse in Scotland's prisons is entwined with overcrowding, workforce pressures, mental ill health, organised crime and regime instability. The figures underline that reality. You see, between 2012 and 2023, 50 drug misuse deaths occurred in custody. I think it was Sue Webber who said that in 2024 alone, 64 people died in prison. That is a 60% increase on the previous year. Now, since 2015, the Prison Officers Association told the committee that drug recoveries have increased by 80% and weapon fines by 181%. And the evidence that they supplied for this debate shows that nearly 40% of prisoners report using illegal drugs whilst in custody. Presiding Officer, these are not isolated statistics. They describe a custodial environment under sustained strain. The committee heard about synthetic drugs, which I think Eleanor Whittam might have mentioned, creating volatility and unpredictability. We heard about organised crime adapting supply routes, including through drones, which the Governor of Perth Prison recently described as public enemy number one. We heard about the operational consequences of Moore's episodes and hospital transfers, which the Prison Officers Association survey has some significant input that we should all be aware of. And I think we're agreed that access to treatment and support is unsatisfactory, as are the levels of continuity of care for people leaving prison. Specifically, our report explored the long waiting times experienced by offenders for mental health assessments, shortages of specialist staff, and frequent disruption to services, all of which limit the provision of effective care. We also heard from prison officers who raised concerns around exposure to drug fumes, about the practical operation of the Moore's policy, about training, about the physical and psychological demands placed on staff, and of course the fact that these are the people who have to deal with the deaths in custody. That evidence must be taken really seriously, and their calls for action around PPE, around investment and staffing levels need to be acted upon. Presiding Officer, I'm very pleased that the committee's report does not frame this solely as a security or a criminal problem, nor does it solely frame it as a public health problem. It is both, as the convener succinctly set out. We made many important recommendations, including on the need for improved national leadership and coordination and the implementation of medication-assisted treatment, MAT, standards across the prison estate. And that's why I welcome much of the Scottish Government's initial response, which acknowledges many of the pressures identified in this report. It sets out work that's underway, including implementation of the target operating model, recovery initiatives, regime reviews and around purposeful activity and family contact. It includes commitments to publish the Alcohol and Drug Strategic Plan in March 2026, to develop and publish national standards for through care support over the next 2 years and continue the rollout and implementation of the MAT standards across the secure estate. That activity is noted, but I speak for the committee, and what is key, what is absolutely the committee's focus is on the outcomes of these interventions. So a future Parliament needs to see deaths in custody reduce. It needs to see drug-related hospital transfers decreasing, access to treatment consistently being proportionate to need, purposeful activity protected in practice, not only in principle, and importantly, the staff safety concerns, particularly around exposure and Moore's implementation, understood, formally reviewed, and maximum protections put in place. On all of these and more, the committee's position is that our future Parliament must be able to assess measurable change, full, honest transparency which enables scrutiny of impact, not only process. Presiding Officer, members across this chamber have rightly spoken about trauma, inequality and mental health. This report addresses those drivers directly and demands firm, concrete action. But it also recognises that recovery cannot take root in an environment of instability. Prevention cannot succeed where regimes are repeatedly disrupted, and staff cannot deliver safe, effective custody if they feel unprotected. As a committee, we have made 50 recommendations across 6 themes. They are practical, they are evidence-based, they reflect consensus reached after extensive evidence gathering. Our report is comprehensive, and our report is coherent. The debate today is important, but what matters far more is what follows it. So when the next session of Parliament considers this issue, it must look for evidence that harm has reduced, that safety has improved, and that custody in Scotland is delivering the rehabilitation we need to see in practice. That is the standard that the committee has set, and it is the standard to which this Parliament must be held. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on substance misuse in prisons inquiry on behalf of the Criminal Justice Committee. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. I'll allow a moment or two for front benches to organise themselves.